I wasn't in a good place that fall, and that's me putting it politely for people who prefer polite stories. My name's Roy Murray. I was 48, and I'd spent most of my adult life in climbing hooks and insulated gloves, hanging off poles in freezing rain while other folks stayed inside and cussed the outage. A lineman learns to trust what he can test: voltage, load, wind speed, tendon pain. Then one spring storm took out a section of feeder line. I took a bad swing from a crossarm, and workers' comp turned into unpaid leave, while the shoulder healed just enough to hurt all day and still not be useful. By August, the divorce was finalized, legal and dry as old plywood. By September, my son Evan had stopped answering calls, except for one voicemail I replayed like it was medicine. By October, I was driving up to my late daddy's hunting place above Black Fir Ridge because town had too many mirrors in it. The cabin sat half collapsed into itself, like it got tired of pretending to be a building and decided to become weather. One corner had dropped where the footings gave up. The porch leaned downhill. Shingles were mostly a memory. Still, the old cast-iron stove worked if you fed it right, and the hand pump by the side wall coughed up water clear enough to trust after a boil. I parked my truck in the same mud rut Dad always used, stepped out into sleet that felt like handfuls of pins, and said out loud, "Well, Roy, this is either healing or a slow-motion bad decision." Boone, my blue heeler mutt, with a white muzzle and stiff back legs, hopped down, shook once, and looked at me the way old dogs do when they already know your plan is foolish and they're coming anyway. I named what I was fighting on the second night because naming things used to help at work. You can't fix a fault until you isolate it. Mine wasn't just divorce, or work, or missing my father, or hearing my own son talk to me like a distant cousin in that last message. It was the long, winter silence. Capital letters in my head like a proper noun and a sentence both. It was sleet on the roof at 3 in the morning and no second breathing in the room. It was the way a spoon sounded against a can when you heated chili for one. It was checking your phone in a place with no signal out of habit, then feeling stupid for hoping. The long winter silence told me the world was indifferent, and I was old enough, practical enough, to believe it. My days settled into plain little chores. I split wet rounds behind the cabin with an 8-pound maul, and bad shoulder mechanics that made me wince and cuss softly, so Boone wouldn't think I was yelling at him. I rehung the tarp over the east wall where wind came through the studs. I dried socks on baling twine near the stove. I reheated canned chili until the edges scorched and called it supper, because it was hot. I checked flashlight batteries twice, then checked them again, because dead batteries in cold country can turn a small mistake into a long night. I walked the ridge trail each afternoon before dark and carried orange flagging tape in my pocket, though I'd hiked those woods since I was 12. Men like me didn't believe in legends. Men like me endured weather, paid bills when work resumed, and kept moving. The trouble was, moving didn't feel like living. It felt like doing penance for a crime I couldn't name. Around dusk, when cloud dropped low and wind threaded through dead fir branches with that dry violin noise, my chest tightened until breathing took effort. I'd sit on the porch step and rub the ache in my shoulder and tell myself, I am a grown man. I am fine. I am still useful. And none of it landed. I told myself I just needed routine. I told myself grief had a schedule if you were disciplined enough. I told myself Evan needed space and I should stop pressing. Then I'd take out my phone, play his old voicemail, and listen to him say, "Hey Dad, tied up right now. I'll call you back this weekend." In that hurried, neutral voice people use with telemarketers and relatives they love from a distance. One morning, I drove down to Miller's Feed and Fuel for propane and coffee, thick enough to stand a nail in. Vera Miller worked the counter with reading glasses low on her nose and a flannel shirt 2 sizes too big. She looked at my shoulder brace, looked at the weather, and said, "You staying up at your daddy's place alone?" I said, "Me and Boone." She handed me change and studied me a second longer than I liked. "Long way to be lonely, Roy." I snorted because she had me dead to rights and I didn't feel like admitting it. "Cheaper than therapy." She gave me half a smile. "Therapy's warmer." That was the whole exchange, maybe 20 seconds, but I carried it back up the mountain like extra weight in my coat pocket. By November, the ridge looked stripped to bone. Sword ferns lay flat from repeated frost. Alder leaves blackened and pasted themselves into the mud. In the mornings, the world was pewter and white breath. In the afternoons, the light went amber for 10 minutes and then vanished like somebody switched off a breaker. Boone and I kept our pattern. Coffee boiled on the stove, shoulder stretches I hated, kindling split from whatever wasn't too waterlogged, trail walk before dark. He limped more on cold days, but never skipped a walk. If I sat too long, he nudged my knee with his square old head and stared until I stood. That dog had one religion, and it was forward motion. I used to joke that he ran my schedule, and by then, it wasn't really a joke. He got me out of the cabin when my own will wouldn't. Alone in that place, the mind goes loud and quiet at the same time. You hear details you'd miss in town, sleet tapping 3 different notes on tin, cedar logs popping sap in the stove, distant creek water shouldering rocks under thin ice. But inside your head, there's static. I'd start with practical planning. If the shoulder holds, maybe light duty by January. If I sell the base boat, I can bridge 2 more months and slide into the old hurts without noticing. Why didn't I hear my marriage ending until paperwork told me? Why did every call with Evan turn into weather talk and silence? Why did I feel more at ease replacing rotten porch boards than saying, "I miss you, son. Please call"? I was good with lines and currents and tension loads. Human repair felt like wiring I'd never learned to read. Some evenings I took a folding stool to the ridge overlook where the wind farm lights blinked far off across the valley, red dots floating over dark timber like patient eyes. I'd sit there with Boone tucked against my boot, hood up, thermos in both hands for warmth, and let cold air do what it does. Clear the noise down to one clean ache. The long winter silence liked that hour best. It would settle over me hard, a pressure behind the ribs, and I'd start bargaining with myself in that old, stubborn way. Don't cry. You're too old for this. Don't cry where the dog can see. Don't cry over someone who won't pick up. I failed most nights. Tears came anyway, sharp and mean, then softer, until I ran out and felt hollowed, but steadier, like draining water from a flooded trench. I kept trying to behave like a sensible man and treat feelings like tasks. I made lists, fix stove gasket, repack wheel bearings on trailer, stretch shoulder twice daily. No phone after 8. One call to Evan every Sunday, no more, no guilt message. Some of it helped, some of it was pretending. The truth was, I missed my boy in a way that embarrassed me. He was 24, grown, working down in Medford with his own rent and his own life. He didn't owe me daily check-ins. I knew that. But fatherhood doesn't retire clean. It just changes shape and keeps aching in bad weather. I'd hear a truck on the logging road below and catch myself hoping it was him, rolling up unannounced with coffee and awkward apologies, like in those movies Dad used to call too neat to trust. One late afternoon, the wind came hard from the west, carrying that wet metallic scent right before sleet. I spent an hour wrestling a blue tarp over the woodpile, fingers numb, shoulder barking, Boone pacing circles because he hated flapping plastic. When I finally got it tied, I stood there breathing steam and looking at the tree line, feeling smaller than I liked. "We endure weather," I said out loud, half mocking myself, half trying to remember who I used to be. Boone sneezed in my boot print and stared toward the ridge trail. Yeah, I told him. "Walk first, pity party later." We headed up through fir and cedar, boots crunching old crusted snow in the shaded cuts, dusk flattening every color to blue-gray. At the overlook, I didn't set the stool. I sat on a stump gone slick with moss and pulled my phone from my coat. No service, same as always. But downloaded voicemails don't care about signal. I played Evan's message once, then again, then one more time like I was trying to wear grooves in the words. Boone stood beside me a while, then eased down against my shin. The sky lowered. The ridge took on that emptied-out look it gets right before weather closes in. I pressed my palms against my eyes and felt the sob rise from somewhere old and deep, the kind that shakes your shoulders and makes you mad at yourself, even while it happens. I cried there in the open with sleet starting up and the dog quiet at my side. And for once I didn't try to stop it early. I stayed bent over with my palms on my eyes and my elbows on my knees, breathing in ragged pulls that fogged and vanished. Sleet tapped my coat hood and the back of my neck, and the stump soaked through my jeans, and Boone's weight against my leg was the only steady thing in that moment. I'd been crying hard enough that my hearing narrowed to my own breath and the small whine in my shoulder, but then a gap opened in the noise so complete it made me lift my head. The jays had quit. The chickadees that usually fussed in the cedar scrub had quit. Even the creek down the cut, always busy this time of year, sounded wrapped in wool. I've worked enough storm calls to know when a place goes quiet because weather is turning. This wasn't that. It wasn't empty. It was attentive. Boone stood up without hurry. No hackles, no warning growl, no stiff-legged alarm. He stepped away from me, one careful paw at a time, and went maybe 10 yards toward the trees where the ridge trail bent out of sight. Then he sat. Just sat there, facing the timber, tail giving one slow thump against frozen duff. He looked back at me once. Not anxious, not confused, just checking whether I was coming. I wiped my face with the heel of my glove and managed, "Buddy, if this is you deciding we're a dramatic pair tonight, I agree." He kept watching the same point between two cedars. I knew that dog. If a stranger came up on us, he went tight and vocal until I told him different. If a deer crossed close, he tracked every move. If a coyote called, he planted himself against my shin and growled low in his chest like an idling saw. None of that happened. He sat like he sat at my father's boots years ago, when Dad cleaned fish on the tailgate and talked to him like a co-worker, waiting on someone he trusted. I told myself the quiet was sleet pressure, and the dog was reading me, not the woods. I told myself tears made a man suggestible. I told myself, in that blunt, present-tense voice that shows up when I'm trying to regain control, this is weather. This is routine. Stand up. Go home. My legs still felt rubbery from crying, but I got upright and turned enough to see the tree line clear. Dark trunks, fern stems pressed flat by frost, old snow in shadow. Nothing moving, no shape, no eyeshine, no branch sway that didn't match the wind. Still, Boone didn't come when I clicked my tongue. "All right," I said, quieter now. "If somebody's there, we're heading back. We ain't trouble." The words surprised me as soon as I said them, not because I believed somebody was there, because some part of me wanted to be polite to a stand of trees. I gave Boone the hand signal for heel. He stood, came back, and tucked against me. As we started down, he glanced behind us twice, then settled. The silence eased in layers. First, the creek found its voice again under the ridge. Then a single jay barked from lower down like he was mad he'd missed something. By the time we reached the cabin clearing, sleet had turned to thin snow and the familiar little sounds were back. Tarp corner snapping, stovepipe ticking, Boone's nails on porch boards. Inside, I stripped wet clothes by the stove, fed oak splits and cedar scraps into the firebox, and tried to think like a lineman facing a fault tree. Step 1. Establish knowns. Known, I cried until I was wrung out. Known, the woods got unusually still. Known, dog behavior shifted in a way that did not indicate threat. Unknown. Why? Candidate causes. Weather front, predator movement, my own emotional overload changing perception. I actually said that list out loud while opening a can of chili, like I was briefing a crew at dawn. Boone gave me a look that said he'd heard worse from me. Night came down hard. The cabin made its usual noises, old boards easing, wind finding seams, one loose hinge talking to itself. But underneath was that same impression from the ridge. Not fear. More like being observed by something patient. I hated that thought on principle. I was tired of my own mind making stories where there were only circumstances. I played Evan's voicemail once, set the phone face down, and pulled my sleeping bag higher. Tomorrow, I muttered into canvas and wool. We do chores, no mysteries. I woke before first light to Boone huffing softly and shifting his paws on the floor. The stove had burned low. The room held that pre-dawn cold that nips your ears first. I jammed boots on, shrugged into my coat, and opened the door to a world washed silver blue. Snow crusted the porch in a thin skin over old ice. The sky was clear enough to show a pale seam in the east. Boone slipped past me, nose up, then stopped dead at the top step. Two smooth stones lay crossed on the porch plank right in front of the door. Not tumbled there, not random. Deliberate, like somebody with careful hands had made an X and then laid 3 fresh wintergreen sprigs on top, stems aligned. I crouched slow, shoulder complaining, and stared till my eyes watered from cold. The stones were creek-worn, flat and grey with tiny quartz flecks. We didn't have that kind around the cabin. Our ground was broken shale and rotten bark. Wintergreen didn't grow this high on the ridge, not near this exposure. I knew because Dad had sent me as a kid to look for it when we dressed venison, and we always had to go lower, near wetter draws. Now what in the world, I said, barely above breath. Boone stepped forward, sniffed the sprigs, then sat beside me, calm as a fence post. No whining, no tail tucked. He looked at the woods, then back to me, as if to say, "There you go." I checked for prints because that's what a practical man does when faced with anything that smells like nonsense. I checked the porch, the patchy snow by the woodpile, the path to the pump, the muddy edge by the truck rut. My own boot marks from yesterday were half filled with sleet crystals. Boone's tracks overlapped mine. No fresh human tracks. No tread pattern, no heel digs. No slide marks from somebody sneaking around in the dark to play a joke on a lonely man in the hills. I stood there, turning in place, scanning for entry points like I was inspecting storm damage. If a neighbor did this, he'd have come by the logging spur, and that crust would show it. If kids hiked up, I'd see multiple prints, and hear at least one laugh they thought they'd swallowed. If wind somehow moved stones and cut sprigs and arranged them on my step, then wind had developed craftsmanship overnight. I picked up one stone and felt its cold weight settle in my palm. Not frozen to the wood, set down after the last icing. The sprig smelled sharp and clean when I rubbed a leaf between glove and thumb. A little sweetness under mint, living scent in a dead cold morning. I put everything back exactly how I found it, and sat on the step, because standing and arguing with evidence was getting me nowhere. Boone leaned against my hip. We watched breath drift toward the clearing and disappear. I don't buy easy stories, I said to no one visible. But I can count, and I can see. The woods offered me nothing theatrical. No snapped branch, no motion where there shouldn't be motion. Just fir trunks, pale fog in the low cut, and the far crow call from down near the road. I stayed there until my fingers numbed through gloves, then went inside to make coffee, the kind thick enough to feel like food. Every few minutes I opened the door and checked the stones again, as if they might have been a trick of low light. They stayed crossed, quiet as prayer. By mid-morning I gave up on pretending I could ignore it. I grabbed my tape measure, a small notebook from the truck glove box, and a carpenter's pencil chewed to half length. I measured the stones, wrote down rough dimensions, noted the direction of the crossed angle, and hated myself a little for doing it with such seriousness. Still, doing the work steadied me. I documented weather, temperature guess, snow crust depth. I even drew a rough map of the porch and nearest visible tracks like it was a scene report. Boone watched from the doorway with the long, suffering expression of a foreman, letting a rookie overcomplicate a simple task. Then I did what skepticism does when it's cornered. I generated alternate explanations faster than truth could breathe. Could have been set there before the storm and revealed by melt. Except the sprigs weren't frost-burned and the stones had no ice bond. Could have been carried by an animal. Except animals don't cross rocks and align stems. Could have been me in some sleepwalking episode born of stress. I actually stood still and pictured myself sleepwalking outside in boots and coat, foraging wintergreen, arranging symbols, then returning to bed with no memory. Even in private, that sounded thin. Around noon, I hiked 50 yards downslope to the little seep where moss stayed green year-round and looked for wintergreen patches just to prove to myself I'd missed them before. Nothing. I cut back toward the old cedar stand where the ground softened and found one smooth stone half buried in runoff that matched mine in shape, but not in finish. Too rough, too local. I pocketed it anyway and carried it up for comparison, then laughed at myself in one short, bitter burst. Roy, you are officially conducting geology against your own front porch. The laugh helped. So did the work. Grief loosened its grip for an hour while curiosity took the wheel. I noticed details I'd been walking past for weeks. The way elk moss cupped ice beads like tiny glass marbles. The faint resin smell where one fir had split from old lightning. The clean edge on a rabbit trail under huckleberry canes. Even my shoulder ache moved to the background as I sorted tinder and restacked kindling. At one point, I stopped dead beside the woodpile. The top row of split sticks on the right side was tighter than I stacked them, ends flush and nested by diameter, almost cabinet neat. I stared, frowned, and pulled one piece to test. Solid, balanced, better than my method, if I was honest. I looked over at Boone. You take in night classes in organization? His ears twitched. He yawned and wandered toward the tree line, then paused and looked back in that same checking way from yesterday evening. Not urgent, expectant. He walked a few steps, sniffed the air, and sat. Again. I didn't follow that time. I wasn't ready to turn every odd thing into a pilgrimage. But I watched him sit there, relaxed as warm weather, and I felt the shape of my days shift a few degrees. The long winter silence had been one solid wall. Wake, endure, sleep, repeat. Now there was a hairline crack running through it. Thin as fishing line, but real. I still hurt. My son still wasn't calling. My life still looked like a busted panel with no clear schematic. Yet I found myself listening for more than wind. Late afternoon brought a brief wash of sun between cloud bands, that rare gold that makes wet bark glow and turns breath into smoke ribbons. I took my coffee to the porch and studied the crossed stones where I had left them. The sprigs had wilted a little but kept their colour, I could have moved them inside, could have tucked them in my pack as proof for somebody in town, maybe for Vera if I wanted to hear her say I needed sleep and company. Instead, I let them be on the step like they belonged there. Boone lay at my feet, chin on paws, eyes half closed, and every so often he'd lift his head and look toward the same cedar line with a softness that didn't fit any warning I'd ever seen from him. When dusk came, I clipped on my headlamp and then left it turned off. Enough light remained to walk by. We took the ridge trail slow, my boots finding old ruts by memory. At the overlook, I didn't reach for my phone right away. I stood listening. The world held its regular sounds tonight. Creek talking, branch creaks, one owl far off. And underneath that, I sensed room for something I couldn't name yet, like an extra chair pulled quietly into a circle. Boone ranged ahead, stopped at the tree line, and sat once more facing in. Tail thump. Wait, I swallowed, wiped my palms on my coat, and spoke into the dim timber before I could talk myself out of it. I ain't here to bother you. No answer came in words, of course. Just a long minute where my own breathing sounded clumsy in my ears. And then, from deeper among the cedars, one soft chest-deep exhale that fogged the air in a broad pale cloud before fading. Boone didn't move. He stayed easy, looking into the trees like he was with an old friend who preferred silence. My pulse picked up, then settled without tipping into panic, and that told me more than anything else. If I had felt hunted, I'd have been halfway down the trail. What I felt was seen. It was a strange mercy after months of feeling erased. We stood there until the cold bit through my gloves. On the walk back, grief came up again, because grief always does, but it shared space with a new, stubborn thread of attention. I checked the shadows for movement, the ground for prints, the edges of my hearing for careful weight shifting in brush. Not because I wanted a story to tell, because something in these woods had answered my worst night with a crossed pair of stones and wintergreen, and for the first time in a long while I wanted to know more than I wanted to hide. I slept light that night, coming up every hour to listen, not because I felt threatened, but because a part of me had finally admitted there was somebody else keeping time out there with me. The stove burned down around 2. I fed it, drank water from the enamel cup by the sink, and stood in my socks at the window, looking toward the cedar stand where Boone always sat and waited. Frost feathered the glass. My reflection looked older than 48, eyes swollen from crying, beard gone uneven where I'd trimmed by bad lamplight. You're either losing it, I told that reflection, or getting introduced to a wider world. Boone thumped his tail once from the blanket pile and went back to sleep like he approved either option. By dawn, the ridge was wrapped in silver fog, so fine it seemed to glow from inside. Boone took point on the trail, moving with that stiff old dog gait that still covered ground better than mine. I stayed a few steps behind, boot soles slipping on frozen needles, breath hanging low. The overlook opened up in front of us and then narrowed again where vine maples and alder scrub crowded the upslope. Boone stopped at the edge of the cedar line and sat the way he had the past 2 evenings, head high, ears loose. He was watching above us, not level with us. That got my attention fast. I followed his gaze and saw nothing at first but fog and trunks and that layered grey light, where distances lie to you. Then a dark vertical shape separated from the trees upslope, not by stepping out, but by rising. One moment it blended into the timber, the next it lifted to full height in a smooth, unfolding motion that made my mind reject what my eyes were reporting. Too tall by half for any man I'd ever worked with. Too broad through the shoulders for a bear standing bipedal. It paused there among the vine maples, and I watched thin saplings bow and spring as it shifted its weight with unusual care, placing one foot sideways to avoid crushing the younger growth. I felt my body do three things at once: knees lock, pulse jump, breathing slow down on purpose. That old utility training part of me started running checklists even while the rest of me stared. Shape, mass, movement, line of travel. No charge posture, no bluffing sway, no head-low threat. It angled away from us and took two deliberate steps along the contour, each placement quiet for something that size. Branches moved, but none snapped. If I had to describe it in work terms, it moved like a good groundman carrying energized line through brush, fully aware that one careless bump could make a bad day for everybody. Boone stood and gave one low, conversational huff, then sat again. Not alarm. Recognition. I whispered, "I see you." And immediately felt foolish, like I'd announced myself at church to a mountain. The figure stopped. The fog drifted for a second, and I caught profile. High shoulders, long arms, head set forward slightly. Dark fur matted darker where damp had hit it. It turned just enough that I saw an eye catch the light, amber brown and steady, not wide and startled, not fixed like prey or hunter, steady like a man listening. Then it shifted sideways again, making room on the slope between us and the trail, as if acknowledging right of way. I told myself this couldn't be real. I told myself fog-stretched scale that grief and poor sleep could make timber look like a body, that I was a practical man with a hurt shoulder and too much silence in his head. I wanted to run, but something made me stay. I knew somehow that I wasn't in danger. Every story I had ever dismissed rattled in one direction. Every field lesson from weather and animals rattled in another. And right there in that grey morning, I stood between them thinking, present tense, Roy. This is happening. Breathe slow. Don't reach for explanations before you finish seeing what is in front of you. When I blinked, it was moving back through the firs, not retreating fast, just withdrawing with the same measured pace. In 3 heartbeats it was shape, then shadow, then nothing but a faint rolling shift in fog. The woods did not explode with sound afterward. They returned in layers like someone easing up a dimmer switch. Chickadees first, then a jay call, then creek noise from the cut below. I stood there with Boone for a long time, hands open at my sides until cold bit through my gloves. "All right," I said finally, voice rough. That happened. Boone leaned his shoulder against my calf and looked offended that I needed verbal confirmation. Back at the cabin, I tried to restore order by doing ordinary things in strict sequence. Pump water, start coffee, sweep ash from the stove lip, check battery lanterns, write down observations in the notebook. At the top of a page I printed in block letters like a work log, 6:41, fog, upper cedar line, large bipedal subject, non-threatening movement, avoided saplings. Then I stared at the phrase large bipedal subject and laughed into my mug until coffee almost came out my nose. I was writing wildlife notes like an insurance adjuster describing a miracle he didn't plan to file. Around midday, I cut 2 apples and put them on the flat stump by the trail bend, the one Boone liked to sniff before our evening walk. I did it feeling ridiculous and oddly formal. "Hospitality offering," I muttered, from one stubborn male mammal to another. I left them there and walked away without looking back, then looked back anyway after 10 steps. That afternoon I drove down for propane, more out of habit than need, and Vera caught me at the counter studying a display of pocket knives like it held life answers. "You look wired, Roy," she said. "Not bad wired, just tuned up. Didn't sleep much." She nodded toward the storm map taped behind her. "Second front's coming in tomorrow night, wet and mean. You got enough dry wood?" "Working on it." She slid my receipt over and kept her hand on it a second. You know old Amos Pike used to trap up your ridge. He always said that mountain had company, never said it's spooky, just said, mind your manners up there and it'll mind you. She shrugged like she wasn't endorsing him, only quoting weather law. Take that for what it's worth. I folded the receipt and pocketed it. Manners I can do. By the time I got back, the apples were gone. In their place, set on the same stump with almost absurd neatness, sat a fan of late chanterelles, clean and unbruised, their caps gold against grey bark. Under a flat rock beside them was a bundle of dry tinder. Shredded cedar bark, curled birch skin, and pencil-thin twigs snapped to match length. Dry as paper, though, everything around us had been damp for days. I crouched there with my mouth half open, turning one mushroom in my fingers. No slug bites, no dirt clumps, foraged, sorted, offered. Boone, I said softly, we have been outclassed. He sniffed the mushrooms, sneezed once, and sat facing the cedars, tail giving that slow, single thump. I gathered the tinder and chanterelles and carried them inside like fragile tools. That night, I cooked the mushrooms in a dented skillet with a little butter and salt, and they tasted clean and peppery and real. Real was the part that kept getting me. Not explainable, but real. The next morning, I found a snare line 50 yards downslope where old trappers had once set rabbit runs. The wire loop was anchored to a sapling, cinched around nothing now, twisted tight where something had fought it. 10 feet away, a cottontail sat under huckleberry, with one hind leg raised, grooming, alive and alert. I saw disturbed needles, a deep print beside the sapling, and the anchor wire untwisted, not cut, like strong fingers had unwound it carefully to spare the animal. No blood, no torn fur in clumps, no predator mess. Just release. I stood there with the cold seeping through my knees and felt my skepticism take another step back, not defeated, just asked to widen. I followed the drag mark of the snare wire uphill and found it coiled on a stump near the trail, laid in a neat circle with a small branch, pinning it in place so wind wouldn't roll it off. That detail did me in more than the strength did. Anybody can break things. Care takes intention. Late day brought the first edge of the new storm front. Cloud lowered, sleet stitched through the trees, and my shoulder lit up hot with every swing of the maul. I was restacking wood under the tarp when Boone gave a short bark. I hadn't heard from him in weeks, not fear, more complaint. I turned and saw him 3 yards away with his front paw held up, an old porcupine quill or thorn stuck between pads. He tried to lick it and flinched. Easy, buddy, I said, kneeling slow. Let me see. He backed off, not from me, from pain. I reached again and he yelped and jerked. Rain thickened, light dropped fast. My fingers were numb and clumsy, and I could feel panic trying to rise over something as simple as a thorn, because when you've been alone too long, small troubles sound like alarms. Then the woods to my right gave one soft brush of movement. Not a crash, not a rush, just presence arriving. I looked up and saw a dark mass at the edge of the clearing, mostly hidden by cedar trunks and rain haze, height and width enough to stop thought. No details held long in that sleet. Boone turned, saw it, and did the same calm thing he always did. He went still, then stepped forward and sat, injured paw hovering. I stayed where I was, one knee in slush, hands open where they could be seen even though I wasn't sure what counted as seen in that weather. The shape shifted lower for a moment behind the trunks, branches moving in a tight, controlled way instead of whipping. Boone gave a small sound in his throat, not pain exactly, more surprise. Then everything settled again, A gust pushed sleet sideways and blanked the clearing white for 2 seconds. When it passed, the dark shape was already easing backward into the cedar line. No rush, no threat display, just gone in pieces, shoulder, shadow, nothing. Boone turned and trotted back to me with both front paws down. No limp. I blinked, looked at his pads, looked toward the trees, then back at him. Between us, on top of the stump where I'd set the coiled snare wire earlier, lay a tiny pale thorn wet with rain. Easy to miss unless you were looking for it. I picked it up between thumb and forefinger. Fresh tip. Not broken. Well, I'll be, I said, half laugh, half shake. Boone leaned into my leg like we'd completed a routine chore. I rubbed his neck and he sighed hard through his nose, satisfied. Thank you, I said, not loud, to the cedars and the sleet and whatever. Listened from just past where my eyes could make sense of things. I held the thorn on my palm while sleet ticked the tarp overhead. The long winter silence wasn't gone, not yet, but it had lost some authority. It had told me the world was indifferent. Standing there with wet cuffs, sore shoulder, a dog putting full weight on a healed paw, and rain-scented cedar all around me. I knew that wasn't the whole truth anymore. That evening, the storm front arrived like it had a grudge. Low cloud pressed down on the ridge until the treetops vanished, and sleet came in hard diagonal lines that hissed across the tarp and rattled the stovepipe. I fed the fire, checked Boone's paw one more time, and held that little thorn under the lantern like it might explain itself if I stared long enough. Boone stood square on all 4 feet, no hitch at all, then nosed my coat hanging by the door and looked at me with the stubborn expectation that had run my life for years. You want the overlook in this mess? I asked him. He gave me one sharp exhale and turned to the door again. I should have stayed put. Any sensible man would have. Visibility was bad, footing worse, and my shoulder had settled into that deep electric ache that warned me not to do anything heroic. But the cabin felt too tight with weather and memory. I had replayed Evan's voicemail twice already and could feel myself getting pulled into the same groove, that old trench of wanting one sentence to mean more than it did. So I pulled on rain gear, zipped to the chin, and stepped out with Boone into sleet that hit like handfuls of gravel. The trail to the overlook was a ribbon of mud, old ice, and slick fir needles. Boone stayed close, checking me every dozen steps. Wind shoved at our backs, then cut sideways through the cedar brake and found the gap at my collar. By the time we reached the open ridge, my gloves were wet through and my beard was beaded white. I sat on the same mossed stump as before, because habit can be stronger than wisdom. Elbows on knees, phone in my hand, world reduced to grey weather, and one old message. I played it again. Hey Dad, tied up right now. I'll call you back this weekend. That was all. 10 seconds. No anger in it. No warmth either. Just a young man moving through his day, not knowing his father would turn that line into a lifeline and a wound at the same time. I played it again. Wind thudded in my hood. Boone pressed against my shin. I could taste salt and cold metal, and the faint medicinal bite of wintergreen still stuck in my memory from the porch stones. The long winter silence climbed up inside me with familiar hands. It said the same things it always said. He's done with you. You failed him slowly, and then, all at once. You are a man people leave in stages. Usually I fought back with chores, lists, practical logic. Out there I had no tools left except honesty, and honesty was ugly. I bent over and let it hit. Not neat tears, not one noble cinematic moment, full body sobbing that made my shoulder flare and my teeth chatter. I cried for my marriage going quiet by inches while I kept pretending work stress explained everything. I cried for my father dying before I learned how to ask him harder questions. I cried for every phone call with Evan where I chose weather talk because it felt safer than saying I was lonely. I cried because I had built a life around fixing lines and keeping lights on for strangers, and I had no blueprint for repairing the two relationships that mattered most. Sleet ran down my neck and mixed with tears, and I didn't care. Boone leaned harder into me until I could feel his heartbeat through wet denim. Then the ridge went still again. Not dead, still. The storm noise softened as if distance had changed. The creek hush came back. No jay calls, no branch chatter, only wind moving above us and one measured shift of weight from the tree line 20 feet away. I raised my head slow, breath hitching, and saw him in full for the first time. 8, maybe 9 feet tall, even with his knees flexed. Dark fur slicked by sleet, shoulders wide as a shed door, arms long and heavy but hanging loose. He stood between two pines where the ground rose, giving me distance and a clear line out if I wanted it. Nothing in his posture pushed forward, head slightly lowered, hands open. Watching me with those calm, amber-brown eyes I had glimpsed in fog, and in that hard weather, they held the same steady attention Boone gave me when my chest tightened at night. No panic, no pity, no demand. I froze and did my old mental drill in present tense because that was the only way to keep from bolting. I am seeing this. I am not asleep. I am not cornered. Breathe in, 4, out 6. Watch hands, watch shoulders, watch feet. Threat has a shape, and this is not that shape. I told myself this couldn't be real, and then corrected myself, right there in my own head. Real does not need your permission, Roy. I wanted to run, but something made me stay. The something was simple. I knew somehow that I wasn't in danger. I was a wreck of a man on a sleet ridge, and this enormous being looked at me like I still belonged to the living world. He moved first, but only to lower himself. Carefully, with astonishing control for that mass, he bent one knee, then the other, and settled onto the wet ground at a respectful distance. No dramatic gesture, no approach. Just sat down in the sleet with his palms resting open on his knees and his head bowed slightly, the way a person sits beside someone in a hospital hallway when words would only get in the way. I stared at him and forgot to wipe my face. Boone stood, gave a soft huff, and walked away from me. Every muscle in me tightened for 1 second, then loosened as the dog crossed the space and leaned his shoulder against the creature's leg like he was greeting an old ranch hand. The creature lifted one hand, fingers long and blunt and unbelievably careful, and scratched behind Boone's ear with fingertip precision. Boone's eyes closed. His tail thumped twice in contentment. A laugh broke out of me through the tears, sudden and helpless. "Well," I said, voice shaking, "I reckon I owe an apology to a mountain with eyes for ugly crying in public." The creature's head tilted a fraction, not confusion, more attention. Boone made the little grown dogs make when scratching hits exactly right. I sat there in sleet with my life in pieces and laughed again, softer this time because the whole scene was so far beyond my category system that humour was the only bridge my mind could build. I had spent months insisting the world was indifferent, and now I was sharing a storm with something enormous and gentle while my old dog got ear scratches like we were neighbours at a feed store. If somebody had pitched that to me in August, I'd have told them to cut back on late-night documentaries. The crying slowed, then stopped. Not because I forced it. It simply emptied out. My breathing steadied. The tight band around my ribs eased in a way I hadn't felt since before the divorce papers. Maybe before Dad's funeral. I sat upright and let cold rain run down my face and looked straight at him. He looked back. We stayed like that a long while, just breathing in the same weather, and the quiet between us felt inhabited, like a room with a fire in it. Eventually, I became aware of the phone in my hand, knuckles white around it. I looked down at the dark screen, thumb over the play icon for that old voicemail. For months I had clutched it like proof of life, as if replaying 10 seconds could hold a relationship still until I figured out what to do. Out there on the ridge, with Boone warm against a leg that could have crushed a stump and chose gentleness instead, I understood I was using memory as a barricade against the harder work of present tense. I turned the phone over and slid it into my coat pocket. Not discarded, carried differently. When I stood, my knees trembled from cold and release. I nodded once, the same way linemen nod across a noisy yard when the message is received, and no more words are needed. He watched me rise, then pushed up in one smooth motion that made his height feel even greater. He did not step closer. He glanced toward the trail where, a week earlier, I had copied the porch arrangement and set 2 crossed stones beside a cedar root without really knowing why. We both looked at it. He took one deliberate step, reached down, and touched 2 fingers to the center of the crossed marker. Then he turned and walked into the pines. No crash through brush, no theatrical vanishing act. Just powerful, careful movement threading between trunks, each footfall placed to spare saplings and soft ground where he could. I caught the scent of wet cedar and earth turned by deep prints. Boone watched until the last dark line of shoulder disappeared into grey rain, then came back to my side and sat. The storm sounds returned in layers. First the hiss of sleet on fir needles, then creak noise from below. Then one irritated jay somewhere down the draw, like he had opinions about all of us. I crouched at the edge of the trail and laid my hand near one fresh print, longer than my forearm from elbow to wrist, toes splayed slightly in the mud, depth enough to hold sleet water. Real again, unavoidable. "Thank you," I said into the pines. Boone leaned into me and we stayed another minute before walking back to the cabin in weather that no longer felt like punishment. It was still cold, still wet, still the same ridge, but the long winter silence had lost its throne. Inside, I peeled off soaked layers, towel-dried Boone, and built the stove hot. We ate simple food, leftover mushrooms, biscuits from a can, coffee black and too strong. I slept without replaying the voicemail. Just slept, heavy and clean, while sleet clicked the roof and wind walked the walls. In the middle of the night, I woke once, listened, and heard what I'd heard before. Old cabin sounds, weather sounds, Boone snoring. Underneath all of it was the felt sense of company in the dark timber beyond the clearing. Not near, not far, enough. Morning came bright and brittle. Storm had scrubbed the sky clear and left every branch edged with ice. I stepped outside with my mug and found the crossed stones by the trail exactly as we had left them, 2 faint finger tracks in the thin mud at center where he had touched. No fresh movement around the cabin except Boone's paw marks and mine. I stood there a long while in my boots and thermal shirt, steam from coffee and breath mixing in the cold, and realized I was not scanning for proof anymore. I was standing in gratitude. By 10, I was in the truck heading down to town for supplies and signal. The road was rutted and slick, and twice I had to ease around blowdown. At Miller's, Vera looked up from the register and narrowed her eyes at me. "You look different," she said. "How so?" "Less haunted," she answered like it was obvious. Then she slid a cup of coffee across the counter before I asked, "Storm treat you all right?" I wrapped my hands around the cup. Rough night, good one though. She studied my face another second and gave a small nod that said she would not pry unless invited. Payphone still works on the side wall if your cell's stubborn. I stepped outside to where there was just enough service by the propane cage and called Evan before I could overthink it. It rang long enough for me to expect voicemail, then clicked. "Hey," he said, cautious. Background noise suggested traffic and a door shutting. "Everything okay?" I looked at frost melting off the store roof and chose plain language. "I'm okay, better than okay, actually. I'm not calling to guilt you. I just wanted to ask if you'd meet me for breakfast Friday. Denny's on Pine, 7 o'clock. If that's too early, pick a time." Silence. Then, "Friday I can do, 7's fine." "All right," I said. "I'll be there." Another pause, softer this time. "How's Boone?" "He's bossy as ever." That got a short laugh out of him. "Yeah, sounds right. See you Friday, Dad." "See you Friday, son." The line ended. I stood there with the dead phone in my hand and felt something settle into place. Not fixed, not finished, but aligned enough to carry load. Friday morning, the diner smelled like bacon grease, burnt toast, and old coffee, which is to say it smelled like every repair week breakfast of my working life. I got there 20 minutes early and chose a booth facing the door because anxiety likes to watch exits. Evan walked in at 7:03 in a grey hoodie and clean work boots, beard trimmed close, shoulders broader than I remembered. For one hard second, I saw him at 12 in a Little League cap. Then, the man replaced the memory and sat across from me. "Morning," he said. "Morning." We ordered eggs and hash browns and spent the first 3 minutes discussing neutral topics with expert skill. Road conditions, his hours at the warehouse, my shoulder rehab. Then the waitress left and the real silence arrived. Evan stirred his coffee without looking up. "I know I've been hard to reach," he said. "I kept meaning to call and then it felt bigger every week." "I know," I said. "I didn't make it easier. I called like clockwork and acted like a debt collector." He gave a tight smile at that because it was true. "You did a little." I took a breath. "I'm sorry, Ev, for pressure, for not saying what I meant. I miss you. That's the whole sentence." He looked at me then, fully, and I saw his eyes gloss before he blinked it away. "I missed you too. Every time we talked, it felt like I was failing some test I didn't know the rules for. That makes two of us." I rubbed my mug between my palms. "Maybe we try simpler rules. Weekly breakfast, no performance review, just food and honesty." He let out a breath that might have been relief. "I can do that." We ate. We talked about his apartment heater that never worked right, and the old pickup he wanted to keep alive another year. He asked about the cabin, and I told him the truth up to the line he could carry. "Been seeing signs up there I can't explain," I said. "Not bad signs. Kind ones, if that makes sense." He gave me a long, unreadable look, then shrugged. "You always were good at noticing details. If you say kind, I believe you." That was enough. On the drive back up Ridge Road, I stopped at a pull-out and sat with the engine off, listening to it tick, cool. The valley spread below in winter colours, muted green and brown and steel blue shadow. I took 2 smooth creek stones from the glove box, crossed them on the dashboard for a second, then moved them carefully to the passenger seat. I knew where they were going. At the cabin, I set those stones on the porch step beside the first arrangement, fresh wintergreen tucked on top from a patch I found lower on the mountain, exactly where I used to gather it with Dad. Boone supervised from the mat like a retired foreman who still judged technique. I stood, wiped my hands on my jeans and looked toward the cedar stand. No movement, no sign, just a quiet that felt companioned. The next Friday, Evan was waiting at the diner when I arrived. He waved me over with 2 mugs already poured. "I figured you'd order sludge coffee anyway," he said. "Thoughtful of you to save me the trouble." He grinned, then got serious. "I talked with Mom this week. We're all still figuring it out. But I don't want to disappear on you again." "I don't want to corner you again," I replied. "Deal?" "Deal." He asked if he could come up to the cabin once weather eased. I said yes before he finished the sentence. We spent 40 minutes arguing cheerfully about whether his truck could survive the upper road in spring mud. When he left, he clapped my shoulder, carefully avoiding the bad side, and said, "Same time next week?" like it had always been normal. I watched him walk to his car with that loose-limbed stride he got from his mother, and felt gratitude so sharp it almost hurt. Back on the ridge, winter kept being winter. Wind still shook the walls. Pipes still needed draining on hard freeze nights. My shoulder still woke me before dawn with a dull pulse. But routine had changed flavor. I split wood and noticed birdsong. I reheated chili and smiled at Boone's impatience. I walked to the overlook at dusk and sat without needing to break open every time. Some evenings the woods offered nothing unusual at all, and that was fine. A few times far upslope, I caught a dark shape moving between trunks with that same deliberate care, never crowding, never asking anything. Once I found dry tinder tucked under the flat rock by the stump after a rain so steady even my kindling sweated. I nodded toward the trees and left 2 apples in return. Near the end of February, after one of our breakfasts, Evan followed me up in his truck, despite my warnings about ruts. He met Boone at the porch with both hands out, crouched and laughing while the old dog licked his chin like no time had passed. We spent the afternoon replacing a sagging joist under the cabin corner. Evan ran the jack while I set shims and checked level. Work gave us the kind of side-by-side conversation men in my family trust, more than face-to-face talk. At one point, he straightened, wiped sweat with his sleeve, and nodded at the crossed stones on the porch. "Those from Grandpa's old trail markers?" "Sort of," I said. A reminder to keep my manners. He looked at me, then at the cedar line, then back. "You going to tell me the full story someday?" "When you ask from curiosity instead of concern, I will." He smiled. Fair. We finished at dusk, hands numb, boots caked, cabin corner sitting true for the first time in years. Before he left, he stood by his truck with keys in hand and said, "I'm glad you went up here, Dad. You sound like yourself again. Maybe better." I considered that. The old me would have waved it off. Instead, I nodded. "I got found up here," I said. "That's the best wording I've got." Spring did eventually push winter back, slow and muddy and stubborn. The long winter silence still visited, especially at night, especially when rain hit tin in that particular lonely rhythm, but it no longer told the whole story. Now, when it settled in, I had counter-evidence, a sleet ridge, an open-handed presence, a dog leaning trust into the world, my son across a diner table saying, "Same time next week." One evening in early thaw, I climbed to the overlook alone. Snow had retreated into shadow pockets. The creek ran loud again, full of melt. I sat on my old stump, took my phone out, and played Evan's voicemail once. Not as a wound this time, just as a record of where we had been. Then I deleted it. Not in anger, in release. I put the phone away and watched light move through the cedars until the trunks turned bronze, and then grey. Boone dozed at my boot. A soft shift sounded upslope, weight placed with care. I didn't turn right away. I smiled into the evening and said, quiet as breath, "We're doing better down here." When I finally looked, the trees held only trees, and that was all right. I sat until stars came, then walked home to the leaning cabin with Boone beside me, crossed stones waiting on the porch, and a life that had room for enormous pain and enormous gentleness in the same honest frame.